Hello readers, I'm Amy and I'm your nonfiction feminist. Welcome to my next edition of I Don't Read That, and today we're going to talk about poetry. So if you don't know already, if you haven't seen my video on young adult books, I will link it down below. My I Don't Read That series is, as the name says, focused on genres or authors or what have you that I don't typically read. However, just because I don't really reach for that genre doesn't mean that there aren't books from that genre that I really, really love. So today, with poetry, I'm gonna get into some pretty hotly debated topics. I have seen a ton of videos on what is good poetry and what is bad poetry, according to, who knows, booktubers, English majors, whoever's making these videos. And a huge author in that topic is Rupi Kaur. I've been saying Kaur, apparently you say Kaur. So Rupi Kaur is probably the first poetry author that I have read in my adult life. I borrowed the book from a friend and I loved it so much that I ended up getting my own copy. Rupi Kaur talks a lot about rape and feminism and just kind of coming into your own and healing from past traumas, all that good stuff. And that also led me to finding Amanda Lovelace and absolutely loving her poetry as well. So, as I just mentioned, this is really hotly debated. What is poetry? What is good poetry? This apparently is Insta poetry or Instagram poetry, and apparently that makes it really, really bad. Well, clearly we've got a lot to talk about in this video. So, as I said, I read Rupi Kaur's Milk and Honey. I absolutely loved it, and I also picked up a copy of The Sun and Her Flowers, which I feel was equally great. I have never, ever been a huge poetry person. I didn't really read it in high school. As I said, Rupi Kaur is the first poetry author that I've read in my adult life, and I read that book last year, I think, and I'm going to turn 26 in September, so does that tell you anything? I don't like poetry. And the reason that I don't read a lot of poetry is I don't get it. I really don't. I like the more flowery language of, say, someone like Ian McEwan, where there are like a lot of metaphors and similes and some really beautiful prose. But whenever it comes to poetry, for me it's like an entirely different level. I just don't get it. Reading poetry in high school, I'm like, I don't understand what in the world this person is trying to tell me. It's just not something that my brain apparently can compute. But I read Milk and Honey, and it was like, I get it. Apparently people don't consider it poetry for multiple reasons, one of those being, like, they're just broken up sentences that are written out in fancy ways. We'll see if I can see, it's like kind of parts of sentences that are just broken up, doesn't take up much of the page. Apparently people take issue with this stuff. But it makes sense to me. Like, you have kind of a basic sentence that's split up into a poetic kind of free verse sort of way. I guess free verse is what you would call it. Again, not a poetry person, don't really know the terminology here. But I love it. For once in my life, I actually understood poetry, and for me, that is where it gets me in the debate. Like, this is poetry. Maybe it's not grand, flowery, pages-long poetry on the essence of life or whatever it is that typical poets write about. This is Insta poetry. It's maybe too easy for some people. It's too simple for some people. It's not good enough for some people, but it's good enough for me, and that's fine. You know, I love it. I get it. I absolutely fell in love with these books. Amanda Lovelace actually has a series. I think it's called Women Are Magic. So you have the princess saves herself in this one, the witch doesn't burn in this one, and the mermaid's voice returns in this one. And that's like super feminist and awesome and a spin on fairy tales, and she goes with that theme, and I love it. I love Insta poetry because it's easy. It's easy to understand. I don't need an English degree to get it. If you've been following my videos, you know that I'm also working on the Bronte sisters. I've read Anne Bronte, next I'm going to be working on Charlotte Bronte, and then I will work my way to Emily Bronte. Now, Emily has a book of poetry. I'm not going to read it. I'm probably not going to understand it if I did choose to read it. I have a feeling that that's more of the poetry that's just not going to come through to me. I'm not going to understand what they're trying to say. But this free verse stuff that doesn't have to be super rhymey, that doesn't have to be heavy on the metaphors, I get it, and it reaches me in a way that the more complex poetry doesn't. So, kind of makes me upset when people are like, this isn't real poetry, this isn't good poetry, because maybe those people are just on a higher level. More poetry that I have read recently, and I don't know that it's actually categorized as poetry, but I recently read 3 Ellen Hopkins books. I read Impulse, what was the second one? Perfect. So Impulse and Perfect are a duology, and then I read Identical, which was actually my favorite of the 3. I think I read an Ellen Hopkins book whenever I was in like middle school or high school. Haven't read her since. Been wanting to read her lately and try her out again because I remember her being really great, but even now, even though she is a much older author, you can't get her at my library because she's always checked out. So, did find it on the Libby app, listened to it as an audiobook where it sounds more like a book, but if you open an Ellen Hopkins book, you know it's free verse poetry. That's one of the only other styles of poetry besides this, I guess, that I can really read and understand and that gets to me. And Ellen Hopkins' poetry, again being free verse, is written out as a book, as a whole and complete story with the beginning, the middle, the end. And again, I loved it. It was beautiful writing. It had a purpose, it had a direction it was going, and it stated its purpose. And it didn't use all these loops and dips and heavy metaphors to get there. And I loved it. Google classifies it as young adult. I'm going to classify it as poetry because it's written as poetry and it's one of the few poetries that I can actually read and that I can get. And so that's why I don't read poetry. For me, poetry just isn't particularly accessible. There you go. That is my apparently 8-minute rant on why I don't read poetry and why I don't like classifying Insta poetry as bad poetry. Because it's not bad poetry. It's reachable poetry. I guess something else you can compare it to, for me, is young adult. As I stated in my last I don't read that video, I don't read young adult. And a lot of that is because of the writing style. For me, the writing style feels too young for me. I need something more adult, more complex, heavier in topics. And that's me. But young adult is super popular. I don't understand all the reasons why, but maybe part of the reason is because it is more accessible for a lot of people. Kind of like reading academic books in college, a lot of those weren't very good books to me because they're not accessible to people. They have a very heavy collegiate language that a lot of people, even college graduates like me, can't really understand. So bringing that back to poetry, Insta poetry is something that can reach everyone, and even if they don't go on to read the more complex poetry, it's still a poetry that's accessible to people and that brings poetry into their lives. I will see you again for this topic probably next month. I have a whole list of different kinds of books and authors that I want to talk about for this series, so I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. Please like, subscribe, and be my friend for more content on what I don't read, what I do read, unpopular opinions, throwing shade at books. I'm here for all of that. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.